I'm Jacob,
And I'm Jaden.
and this is
The State of Things.
And with me, as always, is the greatest vice president that this campus has ever had, Jaden Ahlrichs.
And with me, as always, here in the Student Innovation Center is your 69th president of the student body, Jacob C. Ludwig. Jacob, how's it going today?
It's going well. It's still cold on campus, which I object to fervently. But, I'm making it through. I'm adjusting.
This is the first day where we're going to get into single digits with the wind chill. And so, I'm still acclimating to the cold weather. And so, not going great for me.
Yeah. I've noticed that you've really started to cling to your hot coffee in the morning as a source of warmth, it would seem.
Yeah, so my coffee, I always make sure to put in the paper cup because, the heat goes through it better. But I know you carry around that big old metal Yeti, and that's not working for you anymore, is it now?
No, it's very cold to the touch, so it hurts my hands while I walk around campus. But moving away from our choice of cups, what's student government been up to this week?
I think one of the big things actually that just came through was our past Senate meeting. We saw big bills introduced to revamp our priorities and criteria, which is kind of our big funding, how we do that, as well as our election code. It gets revamped every year, and so those bills are starting to come through, seeing how elections are going to be run in the spring. And so you want to talk about what those documents are?
Yeah, election code and PNC are some of the two biggest documents that we approve every year. Election code obviously covers how our elections are governed here in student government, so that how you can campaign for Senate or executive branch, or how much money you can spend, stuff like that, where you can do all those things. So there's a lot of rules in there that are really important, and so every year we review them, and the Election Commission brings us proposed changes to the code, so that hopefully every year we do it a little bit better. It's a little bit more accessible, and we run into fewer problems of maybe people bending the rules or doing something that they probably shouldn't be doing. And then with PNC, that's the document that really guides our annuals funding process. It's how we fund over 100 clubs each year. Those are the rules that we follow, and so. Every year we kind of review the rules that we have in PNC and set them before we go into annual, so that we kind of have them going in and everyone knows what the standards are. And so we'll have the bill come through. I think there's just a handful of changes coming on, and so refine that a little bit, get it ready, and then this spring any student organizations that qualify for student government funding, which you can find those those qualifications on the student government website. Those organizations can come in and request funding from student government in our annual allocations process. Last year was, I think, over 100 clubs. And this year, we're always aiming to get as many clubs as possible through through our doors, because the more clubs we fund, the better.
I think that's something that I've seen improve tremendously over the past couple of years, especially with PNC and our election code, is we're always trying to work on getting more students from more backgrounds involved in student government. And when those documents were originally drafted, Lord knows how many years ago, I think they were drafted very logistically on how things should run and all of this. But sometimes that prevented barriers for students from accessing the resources or running for a Senate seat in our elections. And so I think that's something we're going to see again this year, is just improvements with easier access for students to get involved and to the resources that student government has.
Yeah, and speaking of engaging with new groups of students, just this week we had our DEI town hall, which went over really well. We had a lot of students there from all different backgrounds, different majors, different colleges, obviously representing a lot of different multicultural groups on campus. And so that was a really great opportunity to, learn about how Iowa State does a good job of supporting multicultural students, but also, and much more importantly, how we don't. What are steps the university needs to take to improve the way that we support those students. And so, I know there were a lot of really valuable conversations in that room. Our team collected a lot of feedback that, we're going to turn around and go to the university with and say, these are some changes that we think need to be made. These are areas where students say they're struggling or not getting enough support. So really excited about how the town hall went over. Mary, our Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, did a really good job, her and the entire DEI committee, They did a great job of bringing that event together and collecting that feedback. And I know we're trying to do these events more regularly because obviously you get kind of a different sampling of students every time you run one of these because you don't know who's going to see the ads or who's going to get invited by their friends. And so we're trying to do these pretty regularly so that we can kind of have that constant touch point with the campus, but really excited about how that turned out. Great event.
I think that's how student government is so successful, is when we actually have those conversations with students. I mean, everyone in student government is a student as well, but sometimes we can seclude ourselves in our roles and stuff. And so I had a student reach out to me and we had a 45-minute conversation. She came in and she just listed off all the problems and different things on Iowa State's campus that could be improved. And I mean, obviously student government can tackle some of those issues, some of them we can't, but I couldn't tell her thank you enough because we lack sometimes so many of these conversations, hearing what real students are doing on campus and what problems and improvements they see. And so I think that's something we always cherish, is when students reach out to us, because then we know the concerns they're having and then we can work on those problems. Yeah,
and that's a big reason why we try and be so proactive with outreach and whatnot, because it's really critical to our success. Because obviously, especially for senators and us, when we run, we obviously try to do a lot of outreach and talk to students, but needs evolve and change. And there's different areas that, you're focusing on when you're campaigning that you might not necessarily, might not be the issue that you have to deal with when you're actually here. And there are things that you just don't always hear about. And so kind of having that continuous line of conversation and saying, okay, well, I wanted to do this and we'll still get this done, but there's also this other problem that needs to be handled. We can, as they say, walk and chew gum at the same time, right? Do what we came here to do, and then also tend to the things that are going on while we're here. And so yeah, it's been a great week.
For sure. And I think on the topic of really listening to what students want in what they are seeing on campus is our special guest for the day. We have Associate Vice President Dr. Pete Englin here with us. I know he does a great job at listening to students, but after this commercial break, catch his interview.
Okay, with us here today is Dr. Pete Englin, the Associate Vice President for Campus Life. Thank you for coming on the pod.
Yeah, and thank you for the invitation. I was excited when you reached out, and happy to talk about what we do.
Yeah, so I've known Pete for quite a while now. My first involvement here at Iowa State was with the IRHA, the Inner Residence Hall Association, and I know you're one of the 3 advisors for that. So I've known Pete for quite a while. He's a great guy. Very happy to have him on the podcast. But I know you're kind of everywhere. You kind of do a lot of different things in the student life, and with the title of Associate Vice President for Campus Life, like, what do you do?
Yeah. So my title is Associate Vice President for Campus Life and / Director of Residence. So Dr. Martino Harmon, who's the previous Senior Vice President for Student Affairs, when he became the Senior Vice President, looked at creating some clusters and reduced the number of direct reports. And so he decided to put housing and dining and the Memorial Union together, kind of the living room, dining room, bedroom of the student experience together, and then created these roles. And so there's the student health and well-being, and there's the Dean of Students role, and then my role. And so I work with all 3 programs with a primary focus on the housing program, both the residence halls and the apartments.
So then I suppose, what does that day-to-day look like? I know you said you've been involved more on the residence side of things, but I mean, what's a day look like for you?
Yeah, so the days really vary tremendously. I have myself around 9 direct reports. Most of those are in the Department of Residence that work with our facilities area, our ResLife program, Simon's Contracting, Communications and Marketing, our Chief Financial Officer, along with Steve Winfrey, who's the Director of our Memorial Union, and our Muhammad Ali, who we may speak about later, our former Director of ISU Dining, and now currently Stuart Essex and Karen Rodekamp are interim co-directors. So the things that affect students' experiences in any of those realms, and that's 900 student organizations, leadership development, facilities projects across all 3 areas. As you mentioned, I co-advise IRHA, and usually in those exchanges, there's a lot that comes out of those meetings that we have every Thursday evening, and so there's some follow-up with some of that, making sure that that what we're promising, we're delivering on across all three areas.
Yeah, so, I mean, you kind of oversee, I think this really integral part of campus a lot of students interact with, especially in their first couple of years. And I think you've shared this story before in other places, so I was just going to ask you to share because it's really interesting to me. This wasn't, your path wasn't originally higher education, was it?
Yeah, well, I somewhat tongue-in-cheek share my undergraduate degree, zoology, emphasis in wildlife management. I'm still working in wildlife management and have been for a lot of years. But I really thought that I would be doing something outdoors and needed to work to pay for school, and I was able to get an RA job and have a great mentor in Prakash Matthew, who was and eventually the vice president for student affairs at North Dakota State. And they kind of talked me into, you can do this as a career. But really, I finished my RA role, I started an MBA program, and it was in that year going, wow, this isn't me. And they said, I know, you should be in student affairs. So counseled into this role. You don't think you go to a university to forever. I say I never graduated. I've stayed at a university my entire life. But it's just been a fantastic experience because there was people in my undergraduate experience that made the degree more possible, made sense of that time there, the friendships, the sense of belonging, how to learn. And
Right.
that was a big jump, so it's great to be part of that.
So what it sounds like to me is you've been in academics your whole life, but you've been on the social side of it. The better half of the academics for that sake.
Yeah, when you talk with students, and when I came in 1989, I looked around as a 29-year-old and I go, oh my gosh, this would have been a great place to go to school. The student organizations and the club programs and the collegiate experience was just, it's amazing. And it is today.
So one thing I know is you have been director for a little while now. Like you've put some good time into the residence halls and the other aspects. And so I guess what are like the big things that you've seen change during your tenure?
Yeah, so one thing I would say is I've been to 350 IRHA meetings over the last 17 years when I kind of did the math, and so those are 350 Thursday nights that we get to hang out. And in that, I really don't think Iowa State students have fundamentally changed. They're very authentic, down-to-earth, practical, great to work with. We can, collaboratively problem solve. And so when we're kind of faced with some of the challenges about, well, what needs to come next, that's been a great exchange. That hasn't really changed much. I do think, and part of our knowledge of coming out of COVID, the students that are showing up now didn't have the same kind of high school experiences a lot of other students had. And so that's really caused us to be thinking about, well, where are those gaps as they show up on campus? Under the best of circumstances, earning a college degree is hard. And so it's understanding what are those difficulties and challenges that students experience, and the concept of belonging, getting connected to all the different experiences that Iowa State offers. We've not seen that level of engagement until this fall. For the last couple of years. This fall, it's jumped. Our director of leadership position on IRHA had 83 applicants. Wow. So, to me, it's like, wow, that's powerful. And it's, we have seen with the growth in the size of the freshman classes, folks always wonder, why do you have all those signs on the side of your building? What's that all about? Because that, from an architect's perspective, they're going, that's wrong. But that's how we break this large place down, and then the 1,100 students who take on leadership positions on those houses with those names, and then the identity that comes with this. It's a springboard to say, stay engaged, not only at Iowa State, whether it's in student government, RA job, or student organization, but when you leave Iowa State in your communities and local government, it's, that's the neat part about Iowa State, is that we've got this foundation that we build, and then the students take off.
That was something I was just going to touch on, was the House and the hall governments. I know that's where Jacob and I both kind of got our start with leadership on campus, and so they are just incubator programs for everything else on campus.
And we're proud of you, but this is, it's part of today's students' expectation. They want to be difference makers. They want to create legacy. And so when you read up on the Gen Z students and what's important to them, we're centered up.
Yeah, I mean, I still remember my Workman House cabinet meetings. It was, I think, second day on campus we did elections, and I was like, yeah, we'll try something out, and then that got pulled me into that, and then that led to student government, and yeah, I think just the sense of community in the residence halls was always fantastic when I was there.
Yeah, and that's, you want to build connections, because I don't care if you're from Ames or, halfway around the world, coming to Iowa State, coming to Ames, it's a major shift, and you're often making major decisions independently for the first time, being surrounded with people who, other students, peer-to-peer is far superior than having this old head, give advice. But that's partly what we try to do, is collectively, in a partnership, all the student leadership pieces that take place at Iowa State, which is tremendous, the level of involvement and invitation we give students to be part of our processes and decision-making, I think we, for the most part, really make much, much, much better decisions for students than a lot of places do, just because of what we have in place.
For sure, I know. So, I mean, I lived in the residence halls for the first 3 years of my college experience. The first was as a resident, and then the last 2 was as a resident assistant. And I think that's a big part of, especially we transitioned from being a community advisor, where we did a lot of event planning, we did a lot more of that side of things. But then COVID, we had that transition to now we're resident assistants, and we're providing a lot more assistance. We're being present for students. We're providing those resources. We're still doing events, but they're a lot more on the educational side of things and learning about how to do college, because for students, it's, the first time of having to deal with everything themselves.
Yeah, a great point. When you think about living on campus, some of the outcomes we hope happen is they're about higher levels of persistence, better grades, more likely to graduate, a greater affinity, sense of belonging. All those things happen. We measure them. The latest challenge would be around that whole sense of belonging, which we don't want to be the only place that creates that. For students who live off campus, we want that also to be created. And I think across the institution, you're seeing ramped up efforts. But in our spaces in particular, RAs, and I'll add our custodial staff and hall directors and apartment directors, are key. I mean, that's where all of this starts to make sense. That's where all they're the catalyst for the connections to the lived experience, how to learn, learning about themselves and learning about others, because I think that's also part of what our residence halls and our apartments provide, but particularly our residence halls, 6,000 new to ISU folks looking around going, dang, I'm with a community of 50 to 70 folks, and how do I fit in, and what do I do with all this? And RAs make the magic happen.
For sure. I know, speaking as an RA, I still see some of my boys out there, that have left the residence hall, and it's just that connection, that bond, that you create with the residents as well. Speaking from an RA position, that's, sometimes it's the first friend, because as an RA, I would go door knocking that first few days and meet people. And so always encourage them to leave your door open. That's the best way you can start your college career on the right foot.
Yep, and know that you're not alone if it kind of feels daunting, and I think that's where sometimes there's this misunderstanding. I don't care where you come from, there's a learning curve, and everyone's interested in trying to get connected together. And when you talk about the relationships, the person who we were best men at each other's weddings, I was his RA, and we just got together a week and a half ago. He's had some significant health issues, but we've been friends and buddies and raising each other's kids and all the whole thing for all these years. And it started as, he goes, I remember seeing you at the end of the hall going, who's that guy, And you were talking to some woman, and then I learned out that's Becky, who I'm married to, who I just started dating, and he met his wife during orientation, and they had started dating, and we started that friendship. And so there's a lot of connection, particularly with social media Facebook or other places. It's easy to stay connected once you build these connections now. They're much easier than writing letters and landlines, you know, back when I graduated.
Yeah, I think the communities that, you know, we've been talking about that are built and the relationships are so valuable, not just because it gives, you know, students those connections on campus that will honestly last probably well beyond their time here at Iowa State, but also in terms of, like, you know, I feel like the residence halls are one of the key ways that we can or key places where we communicate, like, valuable information to students. You know, RAs do a lot with their bulletin boards. I know that the department communicates with residents about, you know, different resources that are available to them, which is just, I mean, it's harder to do for off-campus students. And so when we have those students in that kind of centralized location, it's really, really valuable for us.
Yeah, and the fact that about at least 90%, 90 to 93% of first-time, full-time students choose to live on campus their first year. And we'll typically see somewhere around half of those folks will come back for a second year, and then you start to see some attrition. But that's a responsibility, and it's an opportunity at the same time. And that's where, you know, when you're talking to prospective students or parents, if you come live here, we'll help this place make sense. So, you know we feel really good when students, you can hear it. It changes. It's not if they're going to graduate, it's when. So their language kind of changes, and the RAs will hear it, and the hall directors will hear it all the time. It's, okay, I'm a little uncertain. I'm not sure I'm going to pay for this. You blew by everything I knew in high school in the first 3 weeks in class, and so now I'm terrified that, you know, am I cut out to do this kind of work? And it's like, you get admitted here, you are. And then the resources across campus in the, you know, in the colleges and our partners in the Dean of Students Office, the whole student health and well-being, counseling, all those things, like, how do we learn where you're at and what you need at that moment? Because it's really the one-on-one connections that make it work. I mean, you can do the communications broadly about some of this, and for some it works, but some of it is when you get shoulder tapped and said, hey, you should think about being on cabinet. You should think about being an RA. You should think about, you know, maybe do an SI, supplemental instruction, or you should, you know, the tutoring programs are outstanding here, and given you're not alone. A lot of folks struggle with these courses, and so that's when this keeps building on each other. And you know, our partners in sorority and fraternity engagement strive to do the same kinds of things. So you put the package together, I would say it's pretty special.
I do think that's something a lot of people don't think about with residence halls. It's, as a freshman, you get randomly assigned with some other person in a room, and that's the year, but there's so much behind the residence halls that make students successful that people don't think about right away that really makes the whole experience worth it.
Yeah, and even the random assignment, because we go back and forth, and there's a student work group actually that proposed, should we look at, like, roommate matching? And, you know, one of the life skills that we hope to teach is you don't always get to pick your neighbors, your work partners, a lot of other things. So how can you thrive, and how can you help others thrive that may not be like you? So if you look at Gen Z, almost half, 48%, identify as a racial or ethnic minority. Now at Iowa State, it's about less than 22% of our students, you know, identify. And then around the LGBTQIA plus continuum, we look like the national. About 21% identify along the continuum, and that's what you'll see nationally. So it's like, as part of this mad science that goes on with all this, there's a method behind what we're thinking of happening. But if we need to do it differently, we're open to doing it differently. If the idea resonates with students and the momentum is, we would really like to see more matching taking place, it would probably help in some ways, but we already have some great metrics about how this works as it does. So, you know, maybe we're piloting some things somewhere and see how well it works. But the students are critical to telling us, what should we be doing? How do we do it? When should we be doing it? And then, you know, also paying attention to those fifth graders who are going to be here in 8 years. What's going on in their world? Because some of the things that we need to do have to start now for it to be ready when they get here.
Yeah, and I think that kind of, you know, that learning experience, you know, just to interact with different people who have different experiences than you is really valuable. I think actually one of the things that I really missed in my experience in the residence halls was that my first year I was in a double room and my roommate never showed up. So I was supposed to have a room with someone else, and so I ended up having the room to myself, which was nice. But I kind of missed out on that opportunity to kind of have that other person have that experience. And like I know a lot of my friends are like still very close with the people they were randomly assigned with their freshman year.
Yeah. Well, Jacob, you turned out okay.
Yeah.
So
I made it through.
But, you know, and I think that's key to understand. There's lots of paths, and what you might want to have happen or think should happen. I roomed with my best friend from third grade, and after half a year, we hated each other. I mean, it's like this. We thought that this would be so simple, and other folks randomly assigned. It's like, you know, they're friends for life, as you pointed out. So that's the art around some of this. We think there's science, but the reality is there's a lot of art to this whole thing. But if you put students together in a context where they're having exchanges, they're talking, they're hopefully being their full selves, they figure this out.
Mm-hmm.
So I do have to ask, while all the residence halls here at Iowa State are wonderful, all these opportunities and the magic is happening in all of them, do you have a personal favorite?
I don't know that I have a personal favorite. They all have their own personality, but my office has always been in Friley Hall, except for the time I served as Dean of Students. So I like Friley. And I spent a lot of time, probably my first 3 or 4 years, walking, and if I'm walking in the building, I'd kind of look for a window to figure out where I was. Oh, there's Lincoln Way. I could, okay, there's Helzer. All right, I think now I know which way I need to go to get back to my office or to get to the dining center. So it's fun to listen to students and parents, because that happens during every move-in in the first few weeks, and other students who come to visit Friley on occasion, because it's a world unto itself with this, given the size, and that it was built in 5 different phases, so you got some weirdness with all of that. So it's got a little unique pieces to it in its own way, but they're all really great. If you go on Cyclone Fanatic, don't want to get pitched, but if you go, there's best dorm, and you go look at people from 40 years ago, 20 years ago, I can't believe they, blew up Knapp Storms, which they did 17 days after I started as director.
What a welcome.
Yeah, well, I've only done 2 cool things as far as my kids are concerned. One, I got to be a dignitary in the Visha Parade, and that they got to be in the closest tent to when they hit the enter button and blew up Knapp Storms because of my role. Other than that, it's like, you're gone a lot, and, so those cool, those 2 things, were pretty memorable, but honestly, it's all the relationships over the course of time and the students' lives that you touched, and it's been amazing.
Talking about Friley, I always thought it'd be a fun challenge to take a resident of Friley, blindfold them, put them in another part of Friley, and then see how long it takes them to get back to their room.
Well, when I first started back in ResLife, I supervised the student security staff. And there was a group of students that would just walk the buildings at night, and they invited me along of a 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning rounds. Okay, well then an alarm went off, and they took up running, and so I took up running after them, and they're faster than me, and pretty soon it's like I'm trying to follow the footsteps because I was getting lost. And this was down actually around the dining freezer area in the basement location, and so they knew how to get there like that, and eventually we rejoined each other, but they wanted to get down there and make sure they were responding to it's a little maze in its own way.
Very fun. I know one more thing I wanted to touch on with Friley. Friley's so big, there's so much going on.
Sure.
But there's Friley Dungeons, and there is plans to currently make that space into the new desk, new hall desk, right?
Well, it's actually going to be the terrace room is where we're going to relocate it. And the dungeons, there's some plans because of the volume of business at Windows. They would like to do some seating in that space, but we want to work with the Friley Hall Senate and talk about how can this space be best used by you The column structure that supports that makes it a little difficult because there isn't this large open expanse, and that you can't create the like a projection room where you could have 150 people watching a movie together. Somebody's having blocked by the columns. But we're looking at doing some changes there. The hall desk will go into the terrace area, and the other neat aspect of this is currently, like, the hall director offices and the grad offices are behind the hall desk. They'll be out in front and accessible. If you've ever been over to Maple Arch, when we did that renovation, we got those things out from behind the desk and made it so if you're getting your mail and you look over and you can see the door open and say, I want to go check in on Brady or Hortensia, you can go ahead and do this. So part of it is to create not only the formal interactions, but a lot of informal interactions. And as part of the dungeon renovation, actually elevators create in the current location of the Friley Hall desk a whole welcome center for housing and dining.
Oh, wow.
Touch screens and a lot of other things, because we get about 25,000 guests. What does it mean to live and eat on campus? We want them to be able to learn that quickly with all the tours. At the same time, if you've got questions for Pete or our new director of ISU dining or something, we're looking at putting elevators in there too, so that the spaces are fully accessible. I mean, that's one of our other challenges with these buildings, most of them being built 60 to 100 years ago, is to make them work for today's and the future students.
Yeah, I think, moving a little bit away from the residence halls, but not too far away,
Sure, yeah.
with the dining side
You
of
bet.
things. I know that there's kind of a lot of stuff going on in dining. Search for a new director. I know
Yep.
that there's been some renovations over the past year or so.
Yep.
What's happening with dining?
So, coming out of the COVID and the staffing, I will just tell you the team has done an amazing job of constantly pivoting. I mean, if you had breadsticks yesterday, I think one of the interim directors, Karen Rodekamp, baked them. She also makes a mean sub at Lance and Ellie's. So these are the ways in which that staff has constantly kind of pitches in, and at the same time trying to think about and learn from our students, well, what is it that you want to see moving forward? And so the renovation of the Union Drive Community Center is substantially done. The response in terms of how it was set up was dictated and driven by what students were asking for and what they would like to see. The same thing around some of the menu items. It's, I think we've used some terminology with the staffing thing about getting back to the basics to a certain extent, but the facilities piece will pivot, even though some folks would call Seasons relatively new. Is their next on is to get to Seasons and do a similar kind of rental. And what do you want for a layout? What kind of food items do you want at the different stations? And do you want it stations and scatter? Because that's kind of the food court concept. But is that what's helpful to you? So we're excited about where that's headed too. And the future dining director really has to be one that's very student-centered and great stewards. So regardless of whether it's room or board, the constant dialogue is about value with students, and how are we providing value that makes sense to our students. And I would say, when you asked the earlier question about what's changed, there's a lot of very individualized expectations. So we were joking before we came on air about, cranberry orange muffins or lemon poppy seed. I mean, if folks have a favorite, they're willing to be strong, passionate advocates to get that in the rotation. And so trying to be all things to all people, which is really kind of the Iowa State way, is where we have to constantly manage what we do and the expectations people have, and and provide that great value, because our students are very cost conscious too.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that I've always loved about President's Halls, and you were just talking about there, you want to consult with students, is that I feel like the students are constantly being engaged in all of these issues. I know that IRHA's consulted a lot, the different hall councils, and that student-centered focus is what I think makes dining and ResLife so impactful and strong.
Yeah, and I will tell you, my time in the Dean of Students office, the Ben Golding and Lisa Deloy were president, vice president when I was serving as Dean of Students, and they came to me and said, would you be willing to advise exec? And I was like, no, that was my inner voice, because it's a tremendous time commitment. But at the same time, I was flattered and honored, because if we're in proximity constantly, both formally and informally, we're going to continue to partner. And so when the opportunity to come back as a director of residence and work in auxiliary, at that time our occupancy was the lowest since 1981. Friday, Helzer had 125 students living in it. There was 40% vacancy rate in our apartments. And a lot of it had to do, we had focused on facilities work, but we hadn't focused on the relationship and the experience. And I'm like, I think I can help. And then the neat part of that is, if you serve students well, more students choose to either live or dine with you, and it gives you the resources then to keep reinvesting. So we went from having $300,000 a year to do projects in all the residence halls and apartments to, now we're running around anywhere from $7 to $10 or $11 million a year to be able to do this. And again, the high point was when we were at 36,000 students and 12,331 were living with us, and we were leasing 1,500 beds off campus, and fraternity houses that were vacant. And we did a lot in 2015, 16, 17, 18 to deal with the expectation of, that people wanted to live with us, and the direction from senior leaders would find a way to serve them. So we were staffing and furnishing all those spaces, and then when things started to get down to what I would call normal, and more likely the future that we're going to see, we integrated all that back in, didn't have to lay anybody off. RAs come on back on campus, and so it's been a great ride, but it's really all about what the students are wanting and needing, and then use the leadership positions to bring those voices together. Because sometimes what I deal with, you asked about, what's my day-to-day like, is to take what might sound like a middle school lunchroom. I mean, it's noisy, but you really can't focus on any one voice. So where's the themes in this, so that we do this right and well? And that's where it's been great working with our student leadership and student government over the years to figure out, well, where are those voices? And I would throw RAs in there too. It's they're asked a lot about, well, what are you seeing here? You get your, fingers on the pulse. What is it that would help you help our students? And that's evolved over the years too.
So I know with your department being so student-centered and really listening to what they want, you mentioned that there's 2 interim directors of dining, and I know you've been kind of in the process of looking for a replacement ever since Muhammad Ali, our past director. I have raved about him before on this podcast. He could have been anyone's second father. I loved him, how's that process going?
It's going great. It's an attractive role, one, because we're self-op. So this gives someone the latitude to pay attention to students and make this, you're not dictated by corporate. You're dictated by what are the students wanting to do. So that's fulfilling. It gives a lot more purpose than some of the other ways in which dining is provided at other universities. So had a great pool of folks. I hear as of yesterday, we're down to 2 finalists we'll bring on campus. We'll announce that quickly. I will share as a thanks to Stu and Karen, Muhammad would show up, and so that, when he started as director of ISU dining, I said, hey, you might want to consider coming to IRHA. And he's like, what do you mean? Really? and every Thursday night they gather, but it's about, you want to have the connections before the challenges come, because they just keep coming. We're not perfect. We make mistakes. We're human beings. Dynamics change. I mean, even when we got to the place when COVID hit and we were going to empty our halls, part of that is talking with our students on housing and dining and making the decision. We're gonna we're going to issue $17 million worth of credits. A lot of places chose to say, we can't afford it. But by the stewardship that Muhammad provided and our teams provided, we were able to do that and keep our teams together. But Stu and Karen started showing up to IRHA too. So Muhammad made that decision back then, and he says, you're right. Of all the things, when you kind of came in, that little nugget of advice was huge, because I had never experienced that. And he'd been at 5 different universities before this. And I said, well, I'm thankful back to Ben Golding and Lisa Deloy, who invited me in as a dean of students, caused me to say that when I was interviewing as director of residence, keep that connection. And Stu and or Karen have been showing up every Thursday since during their interim roles.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it is. Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, and for all the years of wrangling the Iowa State wildlife. Doing great work over in Campus Life, and yeah, thanks again for coming on.
No, thank you so much for having me. The nervous part of me was, how do you do justice to the 400 permanent employees and the 1,300 student employees that make all this happen across the union and the dining center and residence and the dining program. And I hope I did enough to honor what they do every day. Great efforts by those folks.
Well, thank you for your leadership, and thank you for making sure that all those people are living up to their full expectations and what they can do. So
All right,
thank you so much, Pete.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
All right. Well, that was a wonderful conversation that we just had with Dr. Pete Englin, our Associate Vice President for Campus Life here at Iowa State. I've personally known Pete since my freshman year, very first few weeks here on campus. I was involved with the IRHA, and he is a very dedicated advisor to that organization. And so throughout the years, I've got to know him even more, everything that he does for campus. I was so glad to have Pete on the podcast today, because he's just a great guy.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really came out in the conversation today was just about how, student-focused the department is. And obviously, it has to be, right? Because, it's where students are living and where they're eating. But they make such an effort at every turn to engage students on the big decisions being made in the dining halls, or dining centers and the residence halls, and really making sure that students have a voice in the resources, that they want to see, or the, different things they want to see in those areas, or also making sure the students are connected to the resources they need to succeed, whether it be academically, health-wise, socially, on campus and beyond Iowa State.
And I think something that Pete talked about a lot as well was truly the magic that happens in the residence halls. I mean, most people think about it as you get a random assignment and that's where you lay your head for the first year here at college. But really, all those different connections that you can make with your RA, with the hall director, with all the people that, you just randomly get thrown into the residence hall with. People are really learning on how to take care of themselves for the first time, especially freshman year. I went through a lot of different learning curves, but that's just something I think a lot of people don't think about with residence halls and how crucial they really are for success here at Iowa State.
Yeah, definitely.
So we had a great conversation with Pete. The only reason any of this is possible is, of course, our executive team in the back room. We have Maddie, our executive producer, Sundar, our production manager, and Ethan, our technical director. And, of course, all of you tuning in every episode, listening to what we can discuss here on The State of Things.